right, we will go ahead and get started. All right, well, hope everybody had a good first week back to the second 8 weeks of the semester. And as you can see tonight, we are going to be talking about the growth of industry in America, and we're going to talk about the impacts that that growth will have on the various social, economic, and political areas of our country. Just to review, as you're reading and going through the assignments, you want to make sure that you're thinking about these objectives, because these are the pieces of material that will be on the first test. But as I mentioned, the first week, you will have the entire week next week to take the test. And it's something that you will be doing from the comfort of your own home or the library. So you should prepare for it because it is timed. But at the same time, you will have the ability to consult your notes and resources and things that you've prepared. So some people, it helps if they actually take and lay these objectives out and kind of write answers to them, not necessarily in an essay format, but in notes format to have to consult for the test. And then we'll talk about the essays in just a second. Braden?
Okay, so we have from now until next Monday to finish the test?
It's during week 3.
It's a whole week from next Monday to Monday.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. So last week we focused a lot on how the political areas of Reconstruction and the Gilded Age impacted the social and economic realms of the nation. So let's take a moment really quick to talk about social impacts of Reconstruction.
African Americans finding their place in the society now that they are free and actually viewed as not as an equal, but as a part of society.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. African Americans have been freed by the 13th Amendment. Remember, the 13th Amendment is unlucky for the South. And so they're now attempting to kind of find their place in society and how they fit in. And of course, they're going to encounter challenges along the way. What else? What else is the social impact of Reconstruction?
The Ku Klux Klan emerges.
Okay, yeah, the Ku Klux Klan emerges in the South, and they're going to have impacts both socially and politically. What else?
With the Indians being put on like reservations.
That starts during this era, yeah, and so absolutely we're going to have a social impact on Native Americans. Other things, and you'll be looking at that, by the way, this week too. Anything else come to mind? Plantation owners. What's the impact on them? It's going to be economic and social.
They lose their workforce and are forced to find new ways to still be successful through sharecropping and other methods with African Americans and poor whites.
Okay, and if they can't restore themselves to their former glory, what would happen to them socially?
They fall down underneath where they used to be.
Yeah, in History 121, one of the things that we looked at, we call it the pyramid of Southern society, and the plantation owners are at the very top, and they're supported by various other groups, including smaller farm owners, landless whites, and then at the very bottom, the enslaved population. And so they're now, obviously the foundation of their existence has been disrupted, so they could tumble down if they can't restore themselves in other ways. What about in the North? What is going to be some of the social impacts of Reconstruction on the North?
They feel like they won.
Okay.
So they're rising in the industry.
Yes. It's so you're tying the pieces together. So they've won the war, and they've also profited from industry. So Northern industrialists are kind of going to be the new elite of the country instead of the Southern plantation owners. The Northern industrialists are going to really be at the top of the social class, and that ties as well to the economic. So we've hit on some of the economic things. What are the other economic impacts of Reconstruction?
The South plantations were devastated, so a lot of that farmland was pretty much in shambles.
Yeah,
So a source of income is out the window.
yeah, having to find new sources of income because the, with the reconstruction, they're trying to restore the nation. Because up to that point, the South, had been very plantation focused. And any other economic impacts? I think we kind of hit the big ones. All right, what about social impacts of the Gilded Age? Social impacts of the Gilded Age. You looked at this more at home this past week. What were some of the things maybe you saw in the video or in some of the readings that you did?
African Americans and women were starting to be rights.
Yeah, it's slow progress, but African Americans and women are starting to gain some rights.
And then industry is becoming more of a focus.
Okay, so economically, industry is really becoming a big focus. What else? Gilded Age impacts. Why is it called the Gilded Age?
Gilding was like very common where people would cover things that weren't valuable in gold just to make it more valuable.
Okay, but the core of them really wasn't
It wasn't valuable.
valuable, yeah. And so things on the surface, it was all this glitz and glamour and they appeared great. But underneath all of it, there was a lot of poverty. There were people struggling in the slums of cities and so on. And we'll talk more about that tonight as we talk about the growth of industry and its impacts. But that was something that was highlighted in the Gilded Age video. We also do have an emerging middle class, which is both a social and economic phenomenon that we'll talk more about today. So tonight we'll be focusing on the rise of industry and how it impacted the nation politically, socially, and economically. And then next week, we'll be taking a look at the challenges and triumphs faced by the United States in the age of expansion. Again, our essay questions are very closely linked to our objectives. And so that last question that we just answered, we hit a lot of the really key points. I'll say this again next week, but do not pre-write your essays. Just outline things that you want to write because the questions are always tweaked just a little bit. I asked for maybe a specific time period when I have them on the test. This is just so you can start to plan. But you always want to make sure that A, you read the prompt on the test, and B, that you make sure you answer it in full. I can't tell you how many great essays I've had in response to that first question that told me all about Reconstruction and then left out everything about the Gilded Age. And so it's asking specifically about Reconstruction and the Gilded Age. So if that's the question that you're leaning towards, make sure that you answer it in full. And as I mentioned, we'll be focusing on the second one tonight and the third one next week. So before we get into tonight's lecture, I just want to review this one question from the Socrative. Last week, when I looked through the results of the Socrative at the end of class, it looked like you guys did pretty well on most of the questions. This was just the one that had the lowest class average and actually the only part that wasn't passing. And I know as we got towards the end of the night in an effort to get you out the door at 8:45, we did rush through this a little bit. So I just want to review this information. Question number 4 asked us, by the time President Grant took office, Reconstruction efforts had, and what would you have picked?
Turned violent.
Yeah, it should be letter C, turned violent, because by that point in time, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the late 1860s helped add an element of violence to the Southern response to Reconstruction. So just make sure that you have that in your mind. One of the very first things that Grant does in his first term is passes that series of enforcement acts in response to this outbreak of violence in the South, and it was an attempt to quell the KKK. But unfortunately, Grant wasn't very forceful with it. And after the third act in 1872, it expired. So what I'd like you to do right now is I'd like you to take a moment and read this quote to yourself. And I'd like you to think about what comes to mind when you read this quote. So what comes to mind? What do you think, Tanner?
I guess it's kind of, I guess it started more during the Gilded Age for sure, during the Industrial Revolution. I think the big banks came up and corporations became more powerful, and it's gotten worse over the years.
So we still have this issue today.
Oh, yes.
Right. Anybody else think that as you read this quote? Could this be, I mean, I don't even tell you when this is from. Could this be a quote from present day, do you think? In the eyes of some people? Anyone disagree? Please, always feel free to disagree. My job is to remain neutral. Right? You guys are quiet tonight. Must be that cold weather. So the last line of this actually does kind of give way to the era that it comes from. It says, as the liveried carriages appear, so do barefooted children. And today, of course, we don't have horse-drawn carriages, but this quote comes from a book called Progress and Poverty that was written by a gentleman named Henry George in 1879. And the quote itself is not something that I would ever ask you to, say from memory. And neither really is the name Henry George. But the big point here is that it's during this time period, during the rise of industrialization in the United States, that we begin to see the gap between rich and poor widening. And that, of course, is a problem that many individuals still feel exists here in America today. And so when I start, of course, you know that we're going to be talking about the growth of industry tonight. So that does give a little bit away about when the quote probably came from. But many people, when they see this quote for the first time, often make that connection to some of the very issues that we have today in present day. I chuckle. I have conversations weekly with my dad. And, he always brings up something political or something about how like the world is so much worse today than it was years ago and all that. And sometimes I just think, people back then were saying some of the very same things that we're saying today. So is it worse? Maybe. Is it different? Perhaps. Each generation and each era has its own challenges. And so we'll be talking about some of those challenges today in our discussion of the Gilded Age and the rise of industry. So just to recap a little bit of what you looked at last week as you explored the Gilded Age video in Ed Puzzle, and also the presidents of the Gilded Age and Cherney's piece on the rise of bankers and entrepreneurs. During the Gilded Age, we're at a point in our country where industry is now reigning over agriculture. And that's a pretty quick shift. As late as 1870, agriculture was still the predominant business in our nation. As late as 1870, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, agriculture was still the nation's biggest business. Bless you. By 1900, it accounted for less than half of the nation's economy. So 1870, it's leading the way. 1900, it's less than half of the nation's economy. Anybody know what it is today, out of curiosity?
I should know.
You should know. You of all people.
Yeah.
Like 25%.
I've got a 25% in the back. Anybody else will make a guess?
Pretty sure it came back up.
It might have come up a little bit, but
I know Virginia's number one. It's the number one in Virginia. You know that much.
agriculture is number one in the yeah. But in the entire nation, what percentage of our nation's economy is comprised of agricultural businesses?
15.
15? Evan?
You said something around like 12 is what I'm looking.
3%, actually a little less than 3% of our nation's economy today is comprised of agricultural businesses. And so by 1900, the very agrarian ideals held by Thomas Jefferson are essentially withering in the smoke that's pouring out of the smokestacks that are beginning to populate our nation. And thus, we are going into the Gilded Age. And the term Gilded Age came from where? Maybe catch that this past week? Mark Twain, very good. He coined this term in 1873, and he, really felt that he said it sarcastically, but really felt at his core that this was a very, very big problem in the United States and something that was going to need to be addressed. And unfortunately, as time goes on, Twain's sarcasm really cements itself into this term for this era, because by 1900, 1/10 of the nation's population held 9/10 of its wealth. So 1/10 of the nation's population by 1900, so 10% of the population held 90% of its wealth. So today we call them the 1% or the 3%. Back then they were the 10%ers, 10% of the nation's population holding 90% of its wealth. Still, despite this disparity, across the board, the Gilded Age saw a rise in the standard of living for most people. At this time, it was still better to be poor in America than it was to be average in most European countries. And that, of course, is going to be a big draw for some of the immigrants that we're going to be exploring this week. So as the gap between rich and poor widens and the exponential growth of capitalism continues to occur, we need to also think about the fact that it is disproportionately happening in our nation. As we alluded to at the beginning of class tonight, the North is where the vast majority of manufactured goods are being produced. Most industry is in the North. In fact, as late as 1900, the South is actually producing less manufactured goods than it had prior to the Civil War. 35 years after the war has ended, the South is still struggling to regain its former foothold in America. And they're producing less manufactured goods than they did before the Civil War. Part of the reason why this is happening is because the North controls the railroads, and the North keeps the South down through railroad pricing. It's not, profitable to manufacture things in the South because the cost of transporting it elsewhere in the nation is prohibitive. And so the North kind of helps keep the South in the agricultural realm more so than the industrial realm as late as the turn of the 20th century. By 1900, though, textile mills do grow in number in the South. And ultimately, by the 1980s, manufacturing will finally boom in the South. And we see that here locally. Those of you that have lived in this area for a number of years, whose families have lived in this area for a number of years, may know that some of the very big manufacturers that we have in this area, like Hershey, for example, and Stewart's Draft, came to the area in the 1980s, the early 1980s. And some of the other manufacturers over there, and even in the Verona area, came to this area during that time period. And so as the 19th century grows to a close and we turn the page into the 20th century, the one other big problem is a rise in government government corruption. And people like Twain and his colleagues are beginning to ask the question of why aren't the best men in politics? What is wrong with politics? Why don't the best minds in our country want to be there? And many would still perhaps pose that question on both sides of party lines today. So it's important for us to remember that Reconstruction does greatly change the social, political, and economic fabric of America. That is certainly indisputable. But big business is going to change it even further. And so some of the things that we're going to be looking at tonight are going to, catapult us into the 20th century and also enact some very, very big changes. So why now? Why big business? What leads to the rise of big business in our nation? Well, here's a pretty simple list, but it's also a pretty comprehensive list. America, as we know, has an abundance of natural resources. And with a rise in immigration in the post-Civil War era, we also have an expanding labor force. Adding to that rise in immigration, we also, of course, have the newly freed former slaves who are now perhaps in some cases looking for other opportunities than remaining in the South and remaining on the farm. And so that's going to add to the expanding labor force, as well as just a general population growth in America. We also have new technology and mass production techniques. The first industrial revolution, as some of you may know, occurred in England in the 1850s. And by the 1870s, it's making its way to America and bringing with it new and oftentimes American improved technologies and mass production techniques. We also see, as you read about last week, a rise in individuals who want to see themselves as entrepreneurs. Simply remaining on the farm is not something that's appealing to them. They want to go to the cities, they want to make money. And what's the easiest way to make money even still today? Be in business for yourself. Government policies are also going to be rather friendly towards industrialists. And of course, tied with that again is this veil of corruption. Many historians said that politicians began to get into bed with big business during this era, and they've been there ever since. So, how else can we talk about the fueling of the second industrial revolution? Well, we're going to talk about three specific things that fuel the second industrial revolution. The first, as we know from the reading that you did this past week, is transportation and communication. So the first thing that's really going to fuel, at the core of fueling the second industrial revolution, is going to be transportation and communication. And by the way, somebody asked last week about what's important to write down. If I repeat something multiple times, that's just a little hint. Might be something you want to know. And you know, as we're seeing the nation expand its transportation networks through what type of transportation is getting big?
Railroads.
The railroads. As we're seeing the nation expand via the railroad, it's bringing along with it communication. Anybody know about the joining of the Transcontinental Railroad? Does that sound familiar? Okay, hopefully from your reading. The joining of the Transcontinental Railroad happens just 4 years after the Civil War ends, 4 years and almost a month. It happens in May 10th of 1869. And I'll never ask you for that exact date, but you should know May of 1869. And it happens in Promontory Point, Utah, when the eastern, eastward to westward section of the railway is joined from the westward to eastward section of the railway. And to celebrate the joining of the two lines, they drive, yes, the golden spike into the ground. And they have a big ceremony, and they have these two trains parked there. It's a very famous picture. But as soon as the ceremony was over, the golden spike was removed, and it was replaced by another spike, which also joined together telegraph lines. So telegraph lines came along with the rail line to facilitate not only transportation, but communication as well. And telegraph lines began to spread throughout the nation. Excuse me. What's going to happen again? Thank you. And also, as we begin to grow our national and international markets for American goods, we also are going to attempt to strengthen communication with Europe. The very first undersea telegraph cable was laid during this era as well. It only lasted for a few short weeks. They didn't quite have it down how it was all going to be protected. But as we know, that's also going to rapidly advance, and soon steadier communication with Europe is going to take place. The second thing that really drives the second industrial revolution in the United States is the widespread use of electric power. The widespread use of electric power. Thomas Edison, of course, is one of America's most prolific inventors. And in 1882, he builds the very first commercial power station in New York City. Just 17 years after the end of the Civil War, we have the very first commercial mass power station in New York City. And the concept of electricity is going to spread rapidly, particularly throughout urban areas. And along with its rapid spread, it's going to revolutionize transportation, our first driving force. With the spread of electricity, we're going to see trolley cars and subways also become major modes of transportation. And then last, in putting the pieces together for the second industrial revolution, we have the systematic application of scientific research to industry. The systematic application of scientific research to industry. Researchers find ways to make stronger steel, refine gasoline to make kerosene. And of course, as we know, the inventions just continue and are going to rapidly fuel this era as well. So the systematic application of scientific research to industry. And so this scientific application of research is going to lead to inventions, which will also spur the revolution. Anybody want to guess, in the first 10 years of our nation under the Constitution, how many patents the U.S. Patent Office issued?
100.
A little bit higher.
10, 110.
110, a little bit higher than that. 276 inventions. And you don't need to know this number. This is just to give you kind of a mental picture of the growth. So 276 inventions were patented in the 1790s. Anybody want to make a guess 100 years later in the 1890s? Okay, not quite that high.
1,000.
What's that?
1,000.
A little bit higher than that. Well, quite a bit higher than that.
1,000.
Anybody say
5,000.
5,000? Try 235,000. So we go from 276 in a 10-year span to 100 years later in that 10-year span, 235,000. And I don't even want to venture a guess today. Some of the big inventions of this time period include barbed wire, which is going to revolutionize life in the West, which you'll be exploring at home this week. Farm implements. Our very own Cyrus McCormick and his reefer will also, as you'll see this week, revolutionize the West. The air brake, steam turbines, rudimentary electronic devices, typewriters. The vacuum cleaner was actually invented in 1869. Internal combustion engines, motion pictures, phonographs, telephones, etc. It was a time that was ripe for invention. So these are some of the things that were invented. And then, of course, the who, this gentleman, of course, is Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison was nearly deaf. Today, many conjecture that he probably would have been labeled autistic if he were in a modern day school system. Schools back then were not adequately equipped to deal with students of different abilities, and he ended up dropping out of school. And of course, thankfully for him, that didn't stop him from being the most prolific American inventor. He was dubbed the Wizard of Menlo Park. What about this guy?
He invented the steam.
The air brake.
Nope. Close case.
All right, George Westinghouse, who would go on to be Westinghouse Electric and also make many home appliances. And this guy on the right, right, Alexander Graham Bell, who, of course, invented a device that most of us today cannot live without. So these were just three of the men who helped create the inventions that would pilot this era of change. And on their coattails would rise a group of individuals that some dubbed robber barons and others dubbed captains of industry. And the term robber baron comes about to describe individuals who basically amassed their means of personal fortune by using exploitative practices. So a robber baron was an individual who got wealthy by exploiting others. So a robber baron got wealthy by exploiting others. Conversely, we have captains of industry. Captains of industry were more upstanding individuals who acquired wealth and used their wealth to better society. So they were individuals who acquired wealth and then used their wealth to better society. George Westinghouse. So they're individuals who acquired wealth and used their wealth to better society. So what we're going to do in just a moment, we're going to split up into some groups. And we're going to take a look at 5 individuals during this era. I know the picture only shows 4 of them. Henry Ford is not included in this picture. But we're going to take a look at 5 individuals from this time period. And using the chart that I provided you, we're going to evaluate whether or not we view these individuals as robber barons or captains of industry. And also, to aid us in this, in Blackboard, some of you may have noticed as you were preparing for class tonight, there is a folder of videos. And these videos also help to give insight into the individuals that we're going to be taking a look at tonight. And so we're going to be looking, as I said, at these 4 men: John Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, and John Pierpont Morgan, and Henry Ford, and deciding whether we think that they are robber barons or captains of industry based on the information that I'm going to provide to you. And so to make this completely anonymous, starting with Doug, let's count off by 5s. So you're 1, 2, 3, 4,
5,
2,
8 and 7. All right, Tanner, you're 1.
3,
4, 5,
1,
2,
3.
4.
All right. So my 1s come down here with Doug. You guys are going to take a look at John Rockefeller. My 2s, who's the 2 back here? You guys are going to come right here with Diana. All right, my 3s, are you a 3? All right, back here with Evan. Yes. 4 guys. My 4s, who is a 4 here? You're a 4, so you can stay put. Come on over here with Kelsey. And then my 5s down front here with Wyatt. All right, so for my groups that have multiple readings, you probably want to divide and conquer. So somebody in the group is a stronger reader, let them take the longer reading. And I'm going to give you guys about 20 minutes to go through your readings, and then you can also pull up on your smartphones or laptops the video related to your person. The videos are under course documents, Unit 1, Week 2. So if you printed out the notes, they will be located there. So they're under course documents, Unit 1, Week 2, and then you'll see robber barons or captains of industry, and there's a video for each individual. So divide and conquer. The chart you may not fill out in its entirety, but it'll hopefully guide you to breaking down information about your individual. And at the end, I want you to be able to answer the question, are they a robber baron or a captain of industry, and why? All right, and you got to have a rationale. Why did you choose that?
Yeah, exactly.
Almost got looked at that. Right. Standard almost took long, so give it, what do we get? I don't know. Ten, which one do you want to read?
I don't do that loud. We read them aloud.
All right, we're gonna conflict, which one separate.
Oh,
Actually,
gotcha.
that's the ones that we should start off.
I can just do the last one. Later, you can make it.
Okay.
Yeah. One, two, three.
I don't know, back. It's the, probably it's the antitrust and we want to do the antitrust.
I can do the antitrust and the later use.
Okay. I'm starting on the rest, all right.
You have to read the antitrust.
No, I'm okay.
She's so much to video, not read that.
They should.
So this doesn't.
think he was robber baron or. Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering about that because he said it seemed like he kind of understood how to save the debt.
Hey, Heather. Heather? No, Mariah, that's it. Okay, just to make sure I have you for attendance. So Mariah, if you want to join, this group. Yeah. And they can spell you in.
Parks and inheritance, yeah. As part of that, he inherited it because he was born into a banking family, so part of it was inheritance. Did you say that you tried their radio competition? Somewhere. His business is difficult for business to do against. Back right here.
Pretty big mess. I feel like we would pretty much like this. So like how we spend everything. He was really pretty severely changed.
His work was like, invested his money.
Well, sometimes, yeah, here's how we really used to have. Well, he came out with problems, so that's probably what he put out.
Just find must be I guess he did donate to this art collection.
And he also supported the unions, which was very different. He was
It seemed like you organized everything.
We're actually doing the event downtown, because I'm part of the event, so I would say that it's we're doing it well.
Did you do anything that how we selected the industries treated? I didn't read that or exactly that. I didn't see.
Yeah, he goes to should start.
Does it say on the video how you did, I didn't see this, but I just assumed like quarterly.
Well, really, I think the information we got, we can't really say.
Yeah, I mean, just also like, what I just like learned from other classes, there's just like dangerous condition, like low pay, which led to like the creation of unions, you know, so.
But for this one, I can't, yeah, I'm just gonna say just a dog because there's really. The other classes just. And we spending money to buy that place.
And then, like, started donated to the University of Chicago, Rockefeller Foundation.
It says he donated 530 million to various charities, but that wasn't so he could have been all bad.
But yeah, he's a Catholic.
I would say that too, because, like, you know, like Nanny's robber barons, trying to use hospitality, they like 71, but paying 300. I mean, that doesn't necessarily make him a robber baron. I'm like, you know, you.
He thought I would say, so much.
Yeah, that's a lot, so.
I wish I had I do have business, but because I'm not just
How are you for the city on work orders?
As a book assistant bookkeeper. I just don't see how he started an oil company. First class, you know. Well, they say that, well, he finished your job, started, so just next week or something. By the age of 20, by the age of 20, like, that in today's money, it's like, it seemed like he had help, but it's good by now.
It's their team and his partner started that. working as commissioner of state. Yeah, I don't see what he can use people, what he may have, but.
It's too bad you sign up. Give it this one. He started up saying. You should do that. But you gotta have some work.
Yeah.
Well, if you base on the definition of what we don't use it to better society. Rather than I can't see what it knows.
Right before you, straight before you get. One right We're on the north side of the town.
I have to live on campus because
There's one that's across the road. It was a regional state voting district. It's the conduit.
There's about something.
Is it that like something?
God, it's starting to be. So it's like 7.
yeah, there's only 7. And I know the marching band. Marching band is like those people that have.
He understood. And at some point, he was successful. He would become everything.
After the Civil War, there were tremendous opportunities for investment from the entire country that needed in large part to be rebuilt. That's why we technology back
Because they do it.
and you did not want to be in a position. You did not want to be.
But I got to make the check.
That's why like.
It really does. In addition to being very strict. And if you don't have it, you can't change Congratulations, you know, for so many. In corporations, using their economic council. They want to set standards that are
Yeah, but I just thought. I do.
See, I can do some.
But, you know, I think that's very cool. Because I think I'm going to be given the
All are very.
Basic question. But I say, discuss it and yeah, so it's just, and it's usually wrong. I'm not gonna like narrow down. Yeah. And now. Exactly. It's great enough. Yeah.
I did the video.
Yeah. Right, my husband was yeah, I hope that all right, so we're a couple minutes over, but if you need to take a quick break, and haven't done that, you need to use the bathroom, go ahead real quick. Yes.
What would you consider if you want to break without
We're gonna talk about that.
Yeah, because I really, it's kind of, you seem like you did benefit on the US side.
Yeah. Yeah, we're gonna chat about that. You may move back to your regular seats if you want. All right, so wait till everybody takes a quick break.
Do you know if Blue Ridge offers help with like fixing computers?
They do, yeah,
do?
they do. Neil is not here. Anybody in here in computer science? Okay, second floor of the T building. There is like a computer fixing place.
Oh, so if you go upstairs, I go to the T building a lot too.
Oh, okay.
If you go upstairs between the two computer labs, like it's T212 and then this little building right in between. So between one, there's two computer labs, there's a door right in the middle. That's what fixes computers.
What are you majoring in?
Civil engineering. So
Oh, okay.
I have aviation technology and electronics degree. And I'm going back to JC, but I gotta take this class.
Oh, okay, so you have a degree in mechatronics.
Electronics and aviation.
From here? Did you have Mr. Goss?
Yeah, I have it right now.
Oh, you didn't let on to that. Oh, have that. What's that? You're running.
Did you get Rocky Fantasy this week?
Did
Did you play Deshaun Watson or Andrew Hopkins?
No, did they break bones or things?
No, they just got a lot of.
No, let's see. In my one league, I lost terribly. Like, yeah, I got a -2 in Miami for my defense, and Eddie Lacy got no points. I need to switch him. Crabtree and Wentz both underperformed. And then in my other league, I think
So how many fights have there been at least so far this year?
there's actually been far more than normal because this freshman class is insane.
That's what my sister was telling me.
Yeah, what grade is she in?
Freshman.
Oh, okay. That's I knew you came to like meet the teacher. I can't remember if that was like this year or last. I knew I saw you at school. I just couldn't remember what it
Yeah,
was.
She said almost every single fight that's happened so far at Lee involved at least one freshman.
Oh, yeah, it has. I think without a doubt, I don't think there's been any fights between upperclassmen, like that weren't freshmen and student
She said they were bad at children too, so.
Wrong?
Yeah, they're just awful children.
Corporal punishment.
Yeah.
Her best friend was one of the ones in one of the fights.
Oh, who was that?
Georgia.
Heard the name, but yeah.
Apparently they got into a fight on the stairs by the cafeteria.
That's where most of them are. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right in front of the administration.
They want to get suspended, even though they don't suspend people anymore.
Yeah. They do. Well, they do. It's just a different type of suspension. Yeah. It's far less fun than getting to hang out at your house and play your Xbox.
Honestly,
She was telling me that she apparently found a chunk of the girl's hair that
Yeah.
her friend pulled out,
bang.
and her friend wanted her to bring it to the office. She's like, no, I'm not doing that.
Nice. All right, guys, we'll give them another minute, and whoever's not back, we'll just get started.
Looks like everyone will watch the Chiefs lose tonight. They've been on it down, but.
Are you Chiefs fan?
No. I was almost worried that the Seahawks, who those?
Oh, that's right, you are a Seahawks fan.
41-38.
Wow. All right, so how we're going to do this, we are going to take a look at various types of industries and then talk about the individuals affiliated with those industries and talk about as well how the viewpoint of your group was on behalf of those individuals. And I don't have a separate slide for Henry Ford, so we'll start with him. He was one of the more complicated figures. Those of you that know of Henry Ford, of course, probably affiliate him with the automobile industry, the person who, of course, started Ford Motor Company and also is known as the modern inventor of the assembly line for industrial production. Ford had actually witnessed the use of the assembly line in the meatpacking industry and then adapted it for the production of what would eventually be the Model T. And of course, capitalized upon that quite well. So my Henry Ford group, tell us a little bit about what you discussed and the conclusion that you came to in relation to Ford.
He was good. He was a big anti-Semitic.
Okay, so he was a big anti-Semite, so he was anti-Jewish.
He was actually very mechanically minded.
Okay.
He left his farm at a young age and started tinkering in things, and eventually he was promoted to chief engineer as a machinist.
Okay. Evan?
Even though anti-Semitic, people who worked with him for over 6 months, so his reputation was pretty big. If he liked you and felt like you can further your knowledge you gave to him, he would split profits with you from the Ford company itself.
Okay, so he did profit sharing with his employees.
He paid them well.
And he paid his employees well. He just wouldn't hire Jews and he wouldn't hire blacks. All right, what else? Other thoughts on Henry Ford?
He was a philanthropist.
Okay.
He did establish the Ford Foundation.
Okay.
And he obviously cared about others. I mean, he did to schools and research and all that other type of stuff. So he did care, but maybe just the way he was raised, his beliefs were just what they were, and you can't help it.
Okay. I don't know if you can't help it, but at that time period, he wasn't necessarily exposed to a greater worldview. All right. So Hitler also actually gave Henry Ford an Iron Cross second class, which was the highest non-civilian honor given in Germany. He was impressed by Ford's dedication to the anti-Semitic cause. Ford wanted to publish basically a piece of propaganda known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is originated in Russia in the early 20th century and claimed that Jews controlled the entire world. We were all puppets on strings. And Ford asked his local newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, to publish it, and they wouldn't because they told him it was propaganda. So what's any good self-serving wealthy industrialist to do? Well, no, he bought the newspaper and published it himself. So that is Henry Ford, very complicated figure. So what did the group come up with? Robber baron or captain of industry?
Captain of industry.
Okay.
But a jerk.
Captain of industry, but a jerk. And some of the captains of industry were jerks. Why a captain of industry?
Because he did better, the people around him. I mean, he helped them.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just for him.
Yeah. And the definition that I gave you didn't say anything about character from the standpoint of outside of the business world. You know, I gave you a pretty narrow definition. So under the definition I gave you, captain of industry would fit. A kind of addendum to the story, in 1994, when they wanted to air Schindler's List on television for the first time, the Ford Motor Company sponsored it to run commercial free. So I'm sure old Henry was spinning in his grave over that one. But they did it kind of as a PR move. And they've been very, very generous to Holocaust-related causes since then. So kind of interesting. All right, our next one, which we're going to watch a short little video to begin, is railroads. And so let's take a little preview look at our next individual.
Pretty much all day, every day, and Grammarly makes my writing better.
Yes, Grammarly is good. I should have left that one on. I should have left that commercial on.
One of the great defining aspects of Andy's career is the good fortune he had to be born within eyesight of the city of New York. And the city of New York back then was a large town, about 30,000 people. Yet it was already on its way to becoming the most important port in North America. Vanderbilt, by being born, in a sense, into transportation, having a father who ran a sailboat, then acquiring his own small sailboat, which ran on waters of New York Harbor. He was involved in transportation virtually from birth. Now that's very important because transportation was the most important business in the 19th century. And when opportunities presented themselves, they almost always appeared in transportation first. And some of his genius as a businessman was seizing on those opportunities. Vanderbilt was so successful that sometimes people think he planned everything in advance. In fact, one of his great strengths was his ability to seize upon opportunities that appeared unexpected and make the most of it.
New York Central shares are dropping fast.
Oh, well.
$20 a share.
Buy everything you can.
The advent of the steam engine, first on water and then later on land, was truly a revolution. Vanderbilt not only went into steamboats from sailboats, he actually mastered the new technology. He studied it. He became the designer of his own steamboats and steamships, and actually took over his first railroad in 1847, while he was still mainly a steamboat and steamship operator. Now that railroad line was the door that opened the way toward his construction of the entire railroad empire. He took these small little railroad lines that had been started before the Civil War, and he began to take them over, to merge them, to connect them, and convert them into large, almost continent-straddling companies and networks which were more efficient, more and far away. In 1869, as the consolidation of his empire is well underway, he begins to create Grand Central Depot It later would become Grand Central Station and ultimately Grand Central Terminal. The New York Times, I believe, said that Grand Central was neither grand nor central, and yet it was an act of foresight. He'd seen New York steadily growing north in Manhattan. He knew that it would be where the center of the city would be eventually. It was also a place where he could build what was then the largest railroad station in the Western Hemisphere and the second largest in the world. It was essentially financed by Vanderbilt himself. It was a very personal project for him, financially as well as in terms of his reputation. And he helps to set the template that these future tycoons who go on to do new and in some ways bigger things, they follow. He sets the ground that they build upon.
All right, so tell me about Vanderbilt. What else did you guys talk about? Who's my Vanderbilt group? Okay.
In the packet that we had, it kind of what was said in the video, it specifically said Vanderbilt became the greatest railroad tycoon of his era almost by accident because he didn't go into purchasing things. He didn't really evaluate it fully. He just kind of went for it and took the chance, and the chances just happened to really work out for him. And we couldn't really find anything that said he treated anyone poorly. He didn't really get into government corruption, anything like that. He's kind of kept his way.
Not directly, but he had his, yes, he had his methods. Right. Other thoughts on Vanderbilt? Brighton, is that a hand or?
Yeah, he would like to invest a lot. He would invest in something, and then almost as if he got bored, eventually he just moved on to something else. You know, it's more profitable and interesting to him.
So what conclusion did you guys come to?
We thought he was more of a captain of industry.
Okay. Okay. Who else was in my Vanderbilt group? Wait, Amy, any additional thoughts?
We all agree with the captain of the industry, but he threw the railroad to help everything connect. He took a lot of things that were struggling as far as railroads, and basically it's also been struggling. We'd invest in it, connect it. I mean, somebody kind of bullied his way over taking over it, but it led to successful transportation across the U.S. And then he also financed, as I said, the building of the Grand Central Station. So.
Yeah, and railroads really, I mean, they have such a big impact. They shrink both time and space. They get things to places quicker than ever before. And also at you know, looking at the scope of the nation, that's huge. That's bringing together all areas of the country. With the expansion of the railroads does come a bit of a political overlap, because you need to put your railroad somewhere. And it's a lot cheaper to force someone to give up their land than it is to purchase it, or to purchase it at a reduced cost, which the American government essentially facilitates for many railroads, not just those associated with Vanderbilt, but other railroad tycoons throughout the era, like Fisk and Gould. Railroad owners during this time period essentially invent the practice of lobbying that we hear so much about today in a negative sense originates during this era, when these railway owners would get individuals to go to Washington and advocate for land, because it doesn't only help them make money, but it does help the nation's transportation system. And so the concept of eminent domain that we have been hearing about in our area in relation to the ACP is an issue back then too, because the railroads need somewhere to go. And ultimately the American government rules, I think thankfully, you know, for us even in modern day, that this transportation network is important to the nation's infrastructure. And the downside of the railroad industry at this time, and this is a Vanderbilt aside, it has nothing to do with him, it just has to do with the concept of the railroads, and I want to share it with you now, is that the railroads grow so fast that loans that are taken out on behalf of them aren't repaid quickly enough. and it causes the securities market to crash. The Panic of 1873 is directly tied to the railroad industry. And it actually was the longest lasting depression. It lasts 6 years. In 1887, the Interstate Commerce Act is finally passed, which helps to rein in the railroads and regulate them a bit and lead to more fair business practices. And the Interstate Commerce Act is also the first attempt by Washington to really regulate businesses. So the Interstate Commerce Act. We already talked a little bit about the Interstate Railroad or the Intercontinental Railroad System earlier, Transcontinental Railroad System. One other thing I want to mention is it leads to the creation of time zones. Prior to this, towns would typically set their clocks according to where the sun was in the sky, which works to some degree, but you had a lot of disparity across the United States, and so the creation of the railroad led to time zones. It did not lead to daylight savings time. That comes later.
Why is Florida yellow in Central Time?
Initially, it was part of Central Time.
Okay.
Now today, it's part of Eastern Time. Yeah, this is the as it was in 1900. And I would say that it more had to do with the sparse population in Florida than it did the actual creation. So these were some of the individuals that helped build the railroads. Those that built from west to east, which was the Central Pacific, were typically Chinese workers. And those that built from east to west were typically Irish or former Confederate and Union soldiers. And so those that went east to west, on average, laid about 10 miles of track a day, and they built over 1,200 miles of the railroad. The Central Pacific only laid 700 miles of the railroad. Anyone make a guess why? The Rocky Mountains, very good. And then there's that picture I was talking about earlier of the driving of the Golden Spike. All right, so our Rockefeller group, you're on call next. Let's take a look at this video of John Rockefeller.
Stock up for summer reading at the Green Valley Book Fair, open June 24th through July 17th. Discover a huge selection of new
Oh, they have
bestsellers,
localized
children's
ads,
books,
yeah.
coloring books, and more. Plus,
Well, no,
you'll
it
find
just said
all the
June.
supplies you need
Oh.
back to school, all up to 90%
Yeah,
off
true.
retail prices.
I didn't think about that
Located
part.
off I-81 at exit 240 near Mount Crawford. We're open June 24th
Guess they
through
should
July
update their
17th.
ad.
For special event updates and a sneak peek of new arrivals, follow us on Facebook and Instagram or visit gobookfair.com.
Mm-hmm.
John Davidson Rockefeller got into the oil business almost as an afterthought. Already a wealthy man by his late 20s, Rockefeller saw the future one cold fall day in 1863 when a new railroad reached Cleveland. Now, Cleveland was linked to the oil-rich regions of Pennsylvania. Dozens of petroleum refineries quickly sprang up along the city's rail lines. Rockefeller knew an opportunity when he saw one. In 1864, he bought his first oil refinery. As the Civil War ended and America's economy became more and more industrialized, demand for kerosene grew in the nation's rapidly expanding urban areas. Rockefeller's profits soared. Despite his success, Rockefeller was not content, but his drive to expand his operations was at the mercy of his suppliers, over which he had virtually no control. The Rockefeller stabilize meant control, and the best way to get control was to buy it. He bought his own ships to transport Rockefeller kerosene from Cleveland to the Midwest, tanker cars to transport crude oil to the company's refineries and warehouses in New York. By 1879, after 15 long years of intimidation, force, and strong arm tactics, the Standard Oil Company controlled an incredible 90% of all refinery operations in the United States. But Rockefeller's overwhelming power caused some Americans to fear that the free enterprise system was in danger. Criticism of Rockefeller reached unprecedented levels. Moving quickly to protect himself, Rockefeller came up with a brilliant plan. In 1882, he organized the Standard Oil Trust.
it was the mechanism by which monopolies were created. What Rockefeller did with all of his oil companies, he, in a sense, folded them into the Standard Trust that ended up owning all of the shares of these companies.
As the 20th century began, the automobile was transforming the oil industry. Gasoline-powered vehicles promised to more than make up for the declining use of petroleum in kerosene production. Between 1900 and 1910, almost 500,000 cars took to America's roads. It was clear that new sources of petroleum would have to be found. Men began looking for the black gold in the most unlikely areas. One of these areas was Texas. The first gusher of Texas crude exploded from the ground on January 10, 1901. It also marked the beginning of the end for Standard Oil's domination of the oil industry. By 1910, Texas-based oil companies were starting to compete for markets throughout the country. The once invincible Standard Oil began to show cracks. In 1911, those cracks burst. On January 6th, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the Standard Oil Trust was in violation of federal laws which prohibited the restraint of trade. Chief Justice Edward White ruled that Standard Oil would have to be broken up.
All right. So, Rockefeller gang. What do you think? Who are my Rockefeller people? Just Luke? Okay, Luke, Tanner, Kira, and Doug. What do you guys think? What'd you talk about? What were your thoughts?
Well, he started off as a bookkeeper assistant, and I don't know if he really came up from the bottom, but like it kind of sounded like he didn't, because he apparently sold his business for like $400,000 at age 20. So, but he had a business partner. But yeah, then he reinvested that into an oil refinery and then took off from there.
Okay.
So.
Doug, you want to say something?
We couldn't really say it was anything in the literature that said he exploited people per se. But one thing in there said that if people went to join his cartel, he would try to drive them out of business. It didn't say he did drive them out of business, but.
So what do you think, Luke? Does that sound like a nice guy?
I mean, he really just invested in his own company until he died.
So did he?
Like really, like gave like half his money away right before he died. It's like the only charitable thing he did.
Okay. So Kira, what did you think?
I didn't really and it really didn't say anything about like truth as one person, but it didn't seem like it didn't show any obvious signs that he was a bad person or he just was mistreating people in general.
So did you guys say captain of the industry or robber baron?
Captain of the industry.
Okay.
And that was unanimous, even though the paper would call him a robber baron, but
okay.
We didn't agree with it.
All right. And that's certainly within the scope of the activity. All right. Anybody else have thoughts on Rockefeller that wasn't in the group? Evan?
I mean, I was looking at it like from a normal man's perspective. I mean, was he involved in any corruption or anything like that? I wasn't aware if he was or not.
He did some things to skirt the rules.
I mean, he wasn't full-fledged into it, to my knowledge. So, I mean, my thought would be maybe he just wanted to make things and not be affiliated with anybody else, and maybe that's why he didn't want to share. Maybe he didn't want, it was either him or nothing in his eyes, and just doing good for it.
Okay. Megan?
I think he was a robber baron because he basically was taking over an industry, and the way he did that didn't benefit society as a whole. Like the Vanderbilt and the trains, right? These trains. Yeah. He benefited the entire nation by connecting railways. And he just kind of jacked up prices and made everyone miserable.
Okay.
He did produce oil for everyone.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but
So without him, then there would be less oil.
he made it into a monopoly. And then when other people were trying to get into the industry, he kind of just shut them down.
There was no one always against it at the time, so was he really being bad?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. My counter to that, though, would be that murder wasn't illegal in Nazi Germany either, so. It's like Godwin's law to win an argument, you just pull out the Nazis. But no, in all seriousness, he wasn't breaking any laws. And until a certain point, the Sherman Antitrust Act gets passed in 1890 and declares that monopolies are illegal. And so what Rockefeller does is that he then reorganizes his companies into a different form of trusts that are less apparent that he owns them all still. And then in 1911, as the video said, the Supreme Court basically says, no, what you're still doing is illegal. And they break it up. He is a controversial figure. Many people do view him as a robber baron, but I think you guys did also make a pretty valiant argument for a captain of industry. It's also making me reconsider the sources I use next time, because I think there are some out there that might be a little bit more harsh on him. But he did, at the end of his life, he does donate money. Rockefeller Center in New York City, is the creation of money from his family on his behalf. And, he did endow libraries and things like that. And so, certainly quite commendable. What Rockefeller practiced was something known as horizontal integration. This is definitely a term if you want to know. As you can see here, basically how horizontal integration works, and it'll be more apparent here in a moment when we look at vertical integration, is Rockefeller essentially owns most of the oil refineries in the United States. And so the only thing that goes up to him when he goes to actually sell the oil are production costs. And so these lines here are simply the production costs. That is all he has to pay. He doesn't actually have to pay the refineries any additional money to purchase the refinement of the oil. He just simply amasses production costs because he owns all of the refineries. So he's only going to charge himself for his overhead. He's not going to charge for additional sale value. And so this is horizontal integration. And this is how Rockefeller makes his money by just owning all of the oil companies that he can get his hands on. There is a journalist by the name of Ida Tarbell who really went after him and pretty much led to the 1911 Supreme Court decision. Tarbell felt that Rockefeller directly caused the suicide of her father's business partner. Tarbell's father and his business partner owned a small oil refinery, and Rockefeller drove them out of business and left them penniless. And she blamed him for the partner's subsequent suicide, and made it her mission as a muckraking journalist, which we'll talk more about later, to get rid of Rockefeller if she could. And she does, as I said, help lead to that 1911 Supreme Court decision. All right, our next group, who are our Carnegie people? Okay, so let's take a quick look at Carnegie.
Down across the lines, it's kind of time for business. It's a hustling talent. All of the teams are competing for city champions. And that starts now.
The story that's most often told by Andrew Carnegie and his family is that they were victims of the Industrial Revolution. Margaret Carnegie decided she was going to take her two boys across the Atlantic because there were no more jobs. Andy was 12 years old. He was uprooted from the family taken on many ships to get from Scotland to Pittsburgh. Andy Carnegie is one of the world's greatest messengers. He works for the telegraph company. But he's got great ambitions, and he teaches himself Morse code and quickly becomes the fastest operator in Pittsburgh. Tom Scott, who is the superintendent for the Pittsburgh division of the Pennsylvania Railroad, needs the best telegraph operator he can find, and he hires Andy Carnegie. Carnegie learns an awful lot from him. And one of the things Carnegie learns from Tom Scott is how to make money. Tom Scott realizes, as does every other railroad executive, that the big money is not from your salary, but by setting up your own companies that are then going to give the Pennsylvania Railroad, build bridges for it, manufacture the iron that goes into those bridges.
Here. This is where I want the bridge, right here.
Carnegie, he becomes one of the key individuals who built bridges up and down the Mississippi River. He preferred to concentrate on his iron company, which had been designed to provide materials for his bridge building company, but which he realized would in the end be much more profitable. And that's because you build a couple of bridges across the Mississippi, but you build, as the nation moves west, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles of rail. But as soon as he gets into the iron rail business, he understands that iron is not strong enough. What Carnegie did when he went into the steel business, he knew that the key to making steel and making it effectively was to bring in chemists who knew precisely the right ingredients to make iron that was strong enough, resilient enough, that could be molded into shapes. And they manufactured a high-grade steel in Pittsburgh, but more importantly, they manufactured it in such large quantities that they could sell it to the railroads. And they could explain to the railroads, it's going to cost you much more for steel rails, but they're going to last long. They're not going to break. I think that one of the reasons why Carnegie becomes so successful is that he's willing to take risks. When he goes into steel, there is not yet the demand for the product that he's going to turn out. When he goes into steel, he's looking 5 years into the future. Carnegie is the first American hero. He is our self-made hero. He starts with nothing and builds an empire and gives away millions to make the nation that he created it, in which he made his fortune a better place.
All right. So what do we think? Carnegie Steel Group.
He showed that through hard work and smart money managing that he made his business to how he got to being that telegraph assistant by doing his job to the best that he could. And once he started amassing money, that he found where to invest it and eventually became the 460 million richest man alive by the end of the time when he sold it to JP Morgan.
Okay. So captain of industry or Robert?
Yeah.
Captain of industry, were you guys universal?
Yeah.
In that one?
Because he gave half his money away to public library, 3,500 public libraries, higher education.
Science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a very philanthropic figure in American history, and also revolutionized American industry in other ways. In 1860, at the beginning of the Civil War, just to give you some figures, America was only producing 13,000 tons of steel, which may sound like a lot, but by 1880, it was producing 1.4 million tons. So in a 20-year period, it went from producing 13,000 tons to 1.4 million tons. And then by 1900, it was producing a third of all of the steel in the world. So that's a pretty big order. And Carnegie, certainly is the leader of that. He did have some character flaws. Some people viewed him as a compulsive liar and somebody who would win at any cost. But as I mentioned, he does do a lot of very philanthropic things, which certainly, are beneficial to the nation at large. And Carnegie, unlike our pal Rockefeller over here, who is producing things with horizontal, making his money, I should say, with horizontal integration. Carnegie's practicing something known as vertical integration. And basically what that means is that he owns all of the measures of production. And so we'll take a look based on this model, how that works. So our bottom level is our natural resources, our mines and our quarries. I'm going to put mines just as an example. So to mine the materials that you need to make steel, it's going to cost you $5 to make a ton of steel. 1 ton. Okay, so that is the cost to take the materials out of the ground and pay the employees to do it. Now, if Clay owns the mine, what is the cost that he's going to have in the mine to get it up to the shipping facility? Are you going to mark this up at all if you own the mine and you own the shipping facility?
No.
No. So the cost here for Clay is $5. Now, if Jackie is buying the minerals, she doesn't own the mine, Jackie's going to have to pay the middleman $3. So 3 plus 5 is 8. So before Jackie even gets her minerals to the shipping facility, she's got $8 invested. Clay has 5. Now, we're going to have another $5 wrapped up in the actual shipping process. So Clay, you're not going to mark it up at all headed to the steel mill, right?
Nope.
So how much money do you have in it so far?
$10.
$10. Jackie still doesn't own the shipping facility, so it's going to cost her $5 plus $8. What's her cost now? 13. Now, to mill the steel, it's going to cost her another $5, as well as Clay. Clay, how much money do you have into it so far? $15. Jackie, the mill is going to charge you another $5 on top of that 13. So how much do you have in it so far? 18. 18. All right, and why is this not adding up? Is my math faulty? I'm not adding on the additional money that it's costing Jackie. We're still ahead. All right, Jackie, we're going to jack the price up on you here. All right, so now going up into the integrated steel company, the final step, Jackie, they're going to charge you $10 on top of the 18 that you have invested, and you're going to sell it now. How much money are you going to need to recover at this point? 28 bucks. All right, Clay, you're going to have a $5 cost yourself here, so you're up to how much?
20.
$20. You each want to make $5. Clay, how much are you selling your steel for per ton?
25.
Jackie, how much are you selling yours for? Plus $5 on a 28? 33, yeah. All right. It's the same quality steel. Where are you going to buy the steel from? Clay's $25 steel or Jackie's $33 steel? You're going to buy the $25 steel. That, ladies and gentlemen, is vertical integration. So it's cheaper to own all the means of production than not, because you save on having to pay the middleman. And so the end product cost, you can still make oftentimes more than your competitor and still sell it at a lower final price, which makes your price more desirable. Does that make sense? Okay, and so that's how Carnegie makes his money. Yes?
Would that make it illegal? So the act that passed where, say, cost of demand makes the price go up.
Mm-hmm.
So what a monopoly would do would hold that price there, falsifying that that's what it is. Would that be, if you wanted to jack it up to her price because he can do it cheaper, what if you wanted to match her so they make more money? Is that wrong? Or?
No. Now, unlike horizontal integration, which is wrong because basically you can charge whatever you want because there's nobody else to buy from, vertical integration is not illegal. It's just smart business practice. Yeah. And so that's one of the other reasons people oftentimes viewed Carnegie more favorably, because it was a more legal means of making money. So Carnegie's steel company eventually gets bought out and turned into U.S. Steel by our final individual, who is J.P. Morgan. And so our last little clip of the night. And our last commercial.
Across the lines, it's kind of time for business. It's an hustling town. All of his teams and the team that's competing for city attention. And that starts now.
JP Morgan was not exactly the opposite of the rags to riches story, but he was rich to richer.
He came from a wealthy family. He was born to privilege. JP Morgan essentially dominated financing in the country.
JP Morgan was really an extraordinary character, steely-eyed, determined, very smart, and somebody who had that characteristic, I will take charge.
This is what's going to happen. There's going to be an end to this war. He understood the business, he understood the game, and at some point he realized that as successful as his father, he could become even more successful.
After the Civil War, there were tremendous opportunities for investment. There was an entire country that needed, in large part, to be rebuilt.
He realized that the country was at a point where finance was going to become absolutely crucial.
What would it take to buy all the homes in New York State? I need a network of power stations. What would it cost to be?
JP Morgan was a huge power, and if you were on his bad side or he coveted your company or the technology that your company had, you did not want to be in that position. You did not want to be organized.
The name of the company's been changed to General Electric.
That's my company.
No more.
Every great business leader I've ever met, in addition to being very smart, very driven, they have this one thing. Screw it, let's go. And if you don't have that, you can't achieve greatness.
I'm going to buy a Carnegie Steel. Carnegie will never sell. Everyone has their price.
Morgan makes him an offer that he can't refuse.
Congratulations, Carnegie. You're now the richest man in the world.
Morgan was able to create an institution that was stronger financially than the government itself.
There was a great suspicion, not entirely apparent, that the corporations were using their economic power to influence the political process.
What do you think? We need to buy the president.
It was like royalty. It was just a different thing. They literally controlled the country. They were the ones that set the standard for the American dream.
We think that we had dominant banks in this country, but nothing like the way that Morgan just talked about.
So what do we think? Who are my Morgan people? Mariah, Asia. Wait, Luke, were you Morgan or were you the previous? You're Rockefeller. All right. So what did you guys think?
He did get us out of the Depression of 1895, which was, of course, very beneficial to the United States. He didn't like competition, like with the General Electric one. He did buy the company before that. So in a way, he kind of was a jerk, and he did just just bought people out and saw like the benefits of it and just bought them out real quick. And then just profited off of that. So he really was that robber baron.
Yeah. Morgan indisputably always seems to be the one that every class picks as the robber baron. And he really kind of just pushes people out of his way and gets what he wants. Carnegie really wasn't ready to sell, and Morgan relentlessly pursued U.S. Steel, or what he would call U.S. Steel. Carnegie, of course, benefits from it financially, but he was kind of strong-armed into selling his business by Morgan, who was just absolutely relentless, and he applied that practice to so many areas of his life. So anybody have any questions about any of these individuals? All right, so we're going to wrap up tonight looking at the human impact of this era and some of the challenges that it brought forth. Between 1860 and 1920, the immigration rate increased rapidly. Between 1860 and 1920, the immigration rate increased rapidly. By 1900, 30% of the population of major cities was immigrant. So 1 in 3 people essentially in major cities were immigrants at this time. And they came to this country for a variety of what we call pull factors. A pull factor in an immigration conversation is a factor that makes someone want to come, in this case, to this country. So what do you think pull factors would be at this time? Or even today? They're essentially the same in many. Amy?
Say jobs and opportunities.
Jobs and opportunities. What else?
Well, like the average poor person here is doing better than like the average person.
Okay, so the ability to gain personal wealth. Somebody over here?
Freedom.
Freedom? Freedom from what? Religious persecution. What else? Political persecution, absolutely. So the same reasons why we came over here during colonial times: opportunity, social and economic opportunity, freedom from government oppression of our political views or our faith, were the same during this era, and in most cases are the same today. People come here for the very same reasons. And pull factors really outweigh what we call push factors. The draw of America was very strong. Certainly there were people who were experiencing difficulties in their countries, but they really viewed this as a place to come and achieve the American dream. That was the big sell at this time in history more than any other era of immigration. These immigrants were pushed from places like Southern Europe, Greece, and Italy, unlike the old immigrants who came from places like England and Germany and France. These guys are coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, the Czech Republic, Poland, Russia, and then also Ireland. As a direct result, of course, we know of the Irish potato famine. Initially, they came here under what we called contract labor. Many immigrants were courted by industrialists who would go overseas and purposely seek out people and say, come to America, I have a job for you, I'll pay your passage, and you sign a contract. That is the 19th century version of what? Not slavery exactly, but indentured servitude, yeah. So there's a way out, but you just have to work for it. Thankfully for most of these people, unlike in the 18th century and 17th century here in America, the contracts were a little bit more steadfast. They didn't keep you locked in them. To give you a perspective of the amounts of people, and there's a chart of this in your book, so you don't need to feel like you have to know these figures hard and fast. But under 3 million people came here in the 1870s. So in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, under 3 million people came here. That number goes up to 5 million in the 1880s and drops back down to 3.5 million in the 1890s. Why would it have dropped in the 1890s?
That one with depression.
Yes. There is a panic in 1893. This is the one that Morgan bails the country out from. And so do people want to come here during times of economic depression? No. If you look at immigration over the last 17 years, since the turn of the 21st century, you see a significant drop in immigration to the United States after the market falls in the end of 2008 going into 2009. And so that's even a trend that still exists today. Now, in the 1900s, the nation's recovered. Morgan's bailed them out. 9 million people come in the 1900s, and then 6 million in the second decade of the 20th century. And that's largely because of increasing immigration laws. And then we'll really see some anti-immigration fervor come forward, and we'll talk about that in a moment. When the immigrants arrive here, they're processed typically in one of two places. On the East Coast, where the European immigrants are processed, we have Ellis Island. So remember, East Coast is Ellis Island, and it's the Europeans. Its busiest year was 1907. And then on the West Coast, closest to Asia, we have Angel Island. So the Asian immigrants came through Angel Island. So that's the way I remember it. Europe, E, Asia, A. And when they got here, oftentimes these immigrants were exhausted. They had been exploited for their passage to get here. They were in very tightly packed quarters on ships in what we call steerage. They arrive here not speaking the language, and they quickly fall victim to many scams and also individuals who are looking to utilize them for corrupt political reasons. Unfortunately, they also encounter a lot of anti-immigrant prejudice. And if you have in your family individuals that came over during this time period, you might have had family stories passed down where, you know, they talk about people changing their names because they wanted to, you know, Americanize themselves to not be the victims of prejudice. And individuals worked very hard to learn English and to adopt American customs, many times forsaking the cultures of their home nations to avoid some of this anti-immigrant prejudice. And sadly, what it really comes down to is it's the old immigrants, the people that were here prior to the Civil War, being hostile towards what we call the new immigrants, the people that come in the post-Civil War era. And so the nativists were individuals who favored those who were American born. The irony of all of it, of course, is that most of these people were not native to the North American continent. Now, the nativists, some of even whom were in our Congress, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was a senator from Massachusetts, was one of the most infamous nativists, led to the passage of some anti-immigration legislation. The very first piece of the anti-immigration legislation that was passed was in 1882, and it was known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882, and it was in effect for 10 years, and it would not allow any Chinese in America to come here, or to come to America during that time. Excuse me, would not allow any Chinese to come to America during that decade. And sadly, we're looking at a time when the Transcontinental Railroad has just been completed, and most of the labor for that railroad, particularly from west to east, was Chinese individuals. So it's like we brought them here, we let them work, we let them die to build the railroad, and then, oh, we don't want any more individuals from that area of the country. And we'll talk a little bit more in a moment about why specifically the Chinese. There was also the formation of the Immigration Restriction League, which sought the passage of anti-immigration legislation, which they're not really successful at getting through until the latter part of the 1910s, despite presidential vetoes by President Wilson. Ultimately, they are the leaders of the nativist movement that will flourish in our country up through World War II. Now, many of these immigrants ultimately would work for the very men that we just looked at. They were fortunate in the aspect that they were needed in the workforce, immigrants were a readily available source of labor for these industrialists, and in many cases were quite disposable. They required very little actual skill in most cases to perform the jobs that they were sought for. So if you didn't show up for work one day, there was somebody standing outside the gate waiting to take your place. Unfortunately, along with this came the exploitation of a lot of children. There were no child labor laws at this time in American history. Those would come as a direct result of this era. But many children and also women began to enter the industrial workforce for the first time during this era. Previously, of course, we know many children worked on farms, but life in the factory is quite different than life on the farm. It comes with a lot less safety and also a lot less oversight. By 1880, 1 in 6 children were working full-time. By 1880, 1 in 6 children were working full-time. And in the South, that number was as high as 1 in 4. In the Southern textile mills, that number was as high as 1 in 4. Now, if you are a child and you are working in a factory, what are you not getting? You are not getting an education. What also is being compromised? Your safety, and what did you say, Evan? You're certainly not getting paid very well. What else? Your health, absolutely. You're a kid, you need to be outside running around playing in the sunshine, not locked in a factory, never seeing the light of day, eating a very meager ration. So you're suffering from poor nutrition, you're suffering from poor health, and ultimately that's going to lead to things like a shorter lifespan. Workers, unfortunately, children and other individuals working in factories had very few rights and abilities to fight for better conditions at this time. Gone were the days of actually knowing who you were working for, and instead they're replaced by many, many individuals working in large factory systems where you can't just walk up to your boss and say, hey, this isn't going well, we need to fix this. So collectively, what are these things going to lead to the rise of? Yes, absolutely. They're going to lead to the rise of labor unions, and they're also going to lead to the rise of strikes. And I'll put all this up here so you have it. But again, these notes are all online under the course documents section. The basic gist of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 is up here, but I'm going to paint the picture for you. And so you don't need to write down anything that's not on the board, but I think it helps, you know, to take it beyond merely words and help you guys kind of imagine what's happening. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 actually begins just up the road, just up 81 in Martinsburg, West Virginia. And it was the result of a worker backlash from a series of wage cuts that had occurred in 1877. As we briefly alluded to earlier, in 1873, there was a depression, and that would lead to a wage cut. This was, of course, during the Grant administration. And in 1877, to kind of compensate for the depression, railroad workers were across the nation suffered a 10% wage cut. And in Martinsburg, the workers decided to take a stand. They decided that in order to fight back, the one thing that they could do is actually walk out onto the tracks and block the tracks so that the trains could not travel, and that hopefully their employers would negotiate with them and restore some of the wage cut that they had taken from them in an effort to get the trains moving again. Sympathies for these workers spread all the way from the East Coast to California. But unfortunately, the owners of these railways did not want to bend, and the protests became violent. They called in individuals to drag the people off the tracks. There was fighting nationwide. Many people die in the vicinity of Martinsburg. Over 100 people perished during the violence. Millions of dollars of property is destroyed, and other strikes spread throughout the country. In San Francisco, the individuals striking were Chinese, and there was particularly significant outbreaks of violence in the San Francisco area that was led presumably, as the business owners claimed, by the Chinese who were working on the railroads there. And it was this action that led to ultimately the passage of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Yes?
When I was reading on this, in fact, remember, they called in actual U.S. troops.
Yes. Yep.
How was that legally done?
How was that legally done? That's a great question. So the federal troops were called in because the president felt that the railway strike was disrupting the nation's commerce, and therefore they could be called in to break it up and re-enable the nation's commerce. It was a very gray area because railways were still fairly new, and there was a lot of debate over whether Congress could control the railways. But at that point in time, that is what stops the strikes. The federal troops are called in, they break up the strike, the workers are forced to go back to work, and in the end, very little gains are actually made. So the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 is a failure, and it's a very violent failure. One news journalist reported that it was the most horrible thing I've ever witnessed, except in the carnage of war. There were 50 miles of hot rails, 10 tracks side by side with as many miles of ties turning into glowing coals and tons on tons of iron skeletons and wheels almost at white heat. And so just like the destruction and the burning that ensued during the strike didn't make the concept of strikes very popular. So other efforts are also in process that were not as violent, at least at the initial outset. One of those efforts was led by a group called the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor, unlike the railroad workers who were very loosely organized and not very official, the Knights of Labor are an official labor union. They're often called our nation's second official labor union. The first was called the National Labor Union. But the Knights of Labor had much more traction. They last a lot longer than the NLU. And they actually were modeled on the Masons, on the Freemasons. They were supposed to be like a secret society. And so there was some, allure to that concept. You had to join, you actually had to go through a ceremony, but anybody could join as long as they were a wage worker. So if you were a doctor, a lawyer, or a banker, you couldn't join necessarily. But as long as you worked for a wage where you were paid hourly, you could indeed join the Knights of Labor. And their big thing was equal pay for equal work. The Knights of Labor advocated equal pay for equal work, and also a bit for the rights of women. 1 in 10 of their members were female, which is pretty shocking at this time in history. The Knights of Labor were led in large part by this gentleman here on the right. He's got a super cool mustache. I mean, Clay's already thinking about how he can grow his mustache like that. They're led by a gentleman by the name of Terrence Powderly. And their big emphasis was boycotts over strikes. Boycotts over strikes. They felt that that was a more peaceful but effective way of moving the efforts forward. Unfortunately for them, they get caught up in a pretty bad situation. It becomes known as the Haymarket Affair. Haymarket Affair takes place at the McCormick Reaper plant in Chicago. Certainly the creation of Cyrus McCormick. And it occurs on May 3rd, 1886, and was the result of worker protests over the 8-hour workday. And basically what ends up happening is the workers go on strike. The McCormick company calls in what are known as scabs. Scabs are workers who will work in your place when you are on strike so that production will continue, which makes the strike kind of irrelevant, because if the company is still functioning and you're on strike, the company is still making money. You're not harming their bottom line. You might be making it a little more challenging to get that bottom line, but you're not harming the bottom line. And so, unfortunately, the police get called in because the protesters outside the McCormick factory are being rather disruptive. And the police end up using some violence to break up the strikers and the strikers who were fighting with the scabs. And some people are killed. And so as a result of the deaths of these strikers, they then hold a rally. And at the rally, there are police there to keep the peace. And a gentleman who is completely unaffiliated with the strikers, an anarchist, comes in and lobs a bomb into the crowd of the police. And 7 individuals are killed, and then an additional 60 protesters are wounded. So the police suffer the brunt of the deaths. And as a result of this incident, the 8 anarchists are put on trial, some of whom were actually convicted and sentenced to death. And as a result of this, though, unfortunately, people associate the anarchists with the labor union, the Knights of Labor, even though they were not related. They're guilty by association, and as a result, the Knights of Labor take a hit and ultimately cease to exist. And so very unfortunate for them that the anarchists took that point in time to make a point about their own issues. And this leads to a downfall in the Knights of Labor, as well as support for unions in general, because people are associating them now with violence. So in the wake of this, a new organization is formed, and it's an organization that some of you might be more familiar with today. It's the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. Today, the American Federation of Labor is known as the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of Labor, and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was another union that was later founded and they combined. It's formed in 1886 and focuses on concrete economic gain. Concrete economic gain. So higher wages, shorter days, better working conditions. Higher wages, shorter days, better working conditions. They sought the implementation of what we call a closed shop. That's not something that exists here in Virginia, to my knowledge, because we are a right-to-work state. But a closed shop is where if you accept a job with that company, you must join that company's union. In Pennsylvania, most school districts are closed shops. So basically, when I was teaching in Pennsylvania, at the district that I was teaching in, if I didn't join the union, union dues were still taken out of my paycheck. I only had to pay 80% of what everyone else was paying if I didn't join. But heck, if you're paying 80%, you might as well pay the full 100% and get the protections that the union is going to give you. The argument is that the union was advocating for pay on behalf of everyone, and so that's how a closed shop works. The American Federation of Labor would be, and still is today, the largest of the labor unions. It peaked until in the 1920s initially, and then rose again till the 1980s. But since then, union membership has been on decline. At its highest, it was in the 20%. Today, it's at about 11% and declining of the amount of people in the United States that are in unions. The AFL-CIO was on the periphery of a strike at Carnegie's Homestead Steel Works in Pittsburgh in 1992. They were intense negotiations with the plant president, a gentleman by the name of Henry Clay Frick, who was left in charge when Carnegie was over in Europe vacationing. Unfortunately for Carnegie, Frick was not very friendly to the union, and he agitates their membership and cuts jobs by replacing people with machines, and does so in a not very nice way. And ultimately begins to lock out union members, who then, of course, strike in front of the factory. Frick then calls in the Pinkertons, who at that time were a rather new, untrained group, not like the later detectives that would grow out of the movement. And the Pinkertons and the strikers get into a fight. Some people are killed in the process, 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons. And then later that month, as the strike is still ongoing, a local anarchist, again, not affiliated with the strikers, attempts to assassinate Frick to make a political statement. And unfortunately, as a result, Frick is not assassinated, but Carnegie loses his patience with all sides and basically tells the strikers to get back to work, or they no longer have jobs and the union is no longer permitted at US Steel. And so again, a strike that has a bad outcome for the labor unions. The last of the 4 so-called great strikes occurs in Pullman, Illinois, outside of Chicago. And this is a really interesting one because the Pullman Palace Car Company had what was known as a company town. Ford also has several company towns by this point in time. Or excuse me, in the years after this point in time, we're not quite into the 20th century. And the Pullman Palace Car Company town was a little bit more restrictive than Ford's later company towns. He would learn a bit from this incident. But what they were is if you worked at this company, you lived in their town. So if I was the factory owner and all of you were my workers, I would provide all of you with housing, but I would deduct the rent from your pay. And then I also owned the grocery store, and I also had the school, and so on and so forth. Well, I cut your wages, but I don't drop your rent, and I don't drop the prices of your groceries. How are you going to feel about that? Pretty ticked off, yeah. And so as a result of layoffs and wage cuts by the Pullman Palace Car Company, which affect the people living in the company town, they decide to, at the behest of the American Railway Union, to go on strike. Now, what do we know about Chicago still today? As far as, what's that?
More people die every day than any other place.
It's a very dangerous city, yes. What else do we know? Think about railroads and airplanes.
Lots of interstate hubs for transportation.
Yes, it is a transportation hub, okay? And so if the trains can't get through Chicago, they're not going to get east and west and through the rest of the Midwest. So if this area is on strike and blocking the tracks, everything's tied up. It ultimately basically paralyzes 27 states and territories. Now, in the end, Grover Cleveland does something pretty intelligent. He hooks up mail cars to the stalled Pullman cars. And now what are the strikers doing? They're stopping the delivery of the mail, which is a federal offense. And therefore he can send in federal troops because you are blocking mail. Therefore you are creating a federal offense. And therefore federal troops get called in. They arrest the organizer of the strike, a man named Eugene Debs. Debs will be arrested many times in his life. He ultimately runs several times on the socialist ticket for president and actually runs from jail in one of his attempts. So very, very interesting man. A couple other unions and movements to know. You don't really need to know anything else aside from what is displayed here. All of these other groups are largely socialist or communist in nature. And they believe in a, kind of more unified society with profit sharing for all, and are birthed, in most of them in the ideals of Karl Marx, who of course is the father of communism. All 3 of these unions are far less permanent than the AFL will be. Now, to start to wrap up tonight's conversation, I want to share with you this political cartoon, which some of you have probably seen before. But this particular political cartoon is depicting the United States Senate. It was published by a cartoonist by the name of Joseph Kepler in Puck magazine in January of 1889. And for those of you that are sitting in the back, we have the US Senate here, and we have this entrance is for the monopolists. And that entrance up there, which is the people's entrance, is closed. And then these individuals coming in say things like the nail trust, the steel beam trust, the copper trust, the iron trust, the sugar trust, the coal trust. What is Kepler telling us?
Political corruption.
About political corruption?
What's happening is the monopoly people are getting the congressman to invest into them, and then the Congress is in there protecting them without the people say.
Yeah. Anybody else? Diana?
I was just going to say that the monopolists are larger in the picture because they have a larger impact on legislation.
Yeah, the monopolists are really pulling the strings. That's what Kepler is saying here. And it is this cartoon and this perception which helps to fuel the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act, the very first piece of anti-monopoly legislation. Because Congress is fearful at that time, a fear they might not have as much today, that they're actually going to get voted out and that they better do something about this to change this perception. And so they pass the Sherman Antitrust Act, which does help to break down the monopolies, but it's not going to be until the passage of a second act, the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914, that the teeth are really set into these individuals. All right, so the final 2 points that I want to discuss just very quickly, and we'll get more into this at home this week, is race relations in the 1890s and then the 1896 election. We are now about 40 years out, 30 years out, I don't teach math for a reason, from the onset of the Civil War. And Civil War, of course, is where you radically change the status of African Americans in the United States. And while it does change for the better with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, there are still many issues that need to be resolved, and certainly unarguably issues today that remain in our nation. And one of the things, one of the kind of the myths that I want to bust right now is the myth that, you know, in the post-Civil War era, the African American community all wanted the same thing. Yes, at the heart, certainly they do. They want freedom. They want the ability to live their lives without interference. And they want the ability to have the same rights and privileges as other individuals in our society. But how to get there is very much debated. And at the core of this debate are two individuals. Anybody know who the gentleman is on the left?
Frederick Douglass.
It is not Frederick Douglass. He would have way crazier hair.
You're right. The first name popped in my head. Booker T.
Booker T. Washington. Thank you. All right, so Booker T. Washington, interestingly, some of you may or may not know this, he was born right near Smith Mountain Lake. He had an enslaved mother, and his father was the white man of the plantation. Booker T. Washington believed that individuals could advance by earning a trade and working at a skilled trade. And so on the basis of this belief that individuals could advance with a skilled trade, he founds the Tuskegee Institute to help African Americans gain skilled trades. And it was his belief that with advancement through the trades, that African Americans could find themselves, you know, a good foothold in society with economic opportunities, and that they could move forth. And, you know, it didn't matter if they were accepted in white society as long as they were successful. Then we have the gentleman on the right. Anybody know who he is? Okay. W.E.B. Du Bois, spelled D-U-B-O-I-S, W.E.B. Du Bois. He was a highly educated gentleman out of Nashville who felt that social equality was paramount. He did not believe in Washington's separatist viewpoint. He wanted full integration into white society, and he also felt that higher education was the way to get there, not through learning a trade. So he disagreed with Washington that a trade could help be the equalizer. He felt that college was the only way to go. And these two gentlemen butted heads for many, many years over these issues. W.E.B. Du Bois would go on to found the NAACP, which, as we're going to see when we get into the 20th century, is going to have some of the most paramount successes for the African American community. But certainly today, many individuals would also say that Washington's approaches do help African Americans advance during this time period, perhaps at that time more rapidly than the approaches of W.E.B. Du Bois. This week at home, you'll be exploring some other issues related to this time period, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. Lastly, I want to end tonight before our recap with the election of 1896. The election of 1896 pits these two gentlemen against each other. William Jennings Bryan, who is on the left, and William McKinley, who is on the right. William Jennings Bryan is a Democrat. He is an individual who champions the poor and travels widely throughout the United States at this time campaigning. He supports changing the United States to a silver standard. He feels that that will help the economy if we stop basing our money in gold and instead base it in silver. The gentleman on the right, William McKinley, is the Republican candidate, and he advocates for the gold standard. Although ironically, in Congress, he was on the side of silver. When he's running for president, he pulls a Mitt Romney and goes for gold. McKinley's campaign touted a full dinner pail for all. That was his campaign slogan, a full dinner pail for all. Remember, 1893, the United States is in a depression. They're just starting to get pulled out of it, and he's promising a full dinner pail for all. Everybody will be able to feed their families. He has $16 million in his war chest versus the $1 million that William Jennings Bryan has. So 16-1, he is outfunded over William Jennings Bryan. He ends up capturing the majority of the electoral vote and thus the presidency in this particular election, and will serve 4 years in office before being reelected in 1900. And we'll talk more about his reelection next week. To end tonight, just to review kind of the lasting effects in this growth of industry. As a result of the growth of industry, we of course see the end of the age of agriculture. We will also see during this era the decline of the spoils system. Those of you that did your readings and activities last week on the Gilded Age presidents, of course, know that when Garfield is assassinated as a result of his objections over the spoils system, his successor, Chester Arthur, essentially puts an end to it with the passage of the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which many of you lauded. The future of politics is altered. It's now big business, big cities, and middle-class values and financial conservatives. There's a rise in urbanization, which we'll explore more fully next week. America's face is changing with the influx of new groups of immigrants, and it's going to be quickly known that there is a need for reform because the guild is wearing off. And so we're going to really start to see exposed the poverty beneath it. For next week, you're going to read chapters 24 and 25 in addition to doing the work in Blackboard that I'm going to show you in just a second. If you have your phones or devices with, you can go ahead and pull up the Socrative app and sign into JGOS 825. I also did want to give you the official heads up. We're going to start class next week at 6:30, but please do check your phones or your emails, I should say, before heading out next week. My flight is supposed to arrive in Charlottesville at 5:10. If anything would happen, that it would get delayed leaving Charlotte at 4:10 or whenever I'm supposed to leave Charlotte, I will send a message out right around 4. And if anything would happen that I get delayed getting out of Charlottesville, I would send a message out to you guys, hopefully by like 5:45. If you get here and I'm not here exactly at 6:30, if you haven't heard anything, I will be here quite quickly. But don't want to be emailing and driving. So just you bear with me, but we'll start class at 6:30 next week. So if you need time to get that extra Starbucks or whatever it is you normally don't have time to get to before class, feel free to go ahead and do that. Anybody still need that room code? All right, so in Blackboard this week, your unit or your week 2 assignments are now open. Some of you still have not done the course intro survey. This is the only thing in class I ever really take late just because I do want to get to know you. So if you haven't done that yet, please do it. Also make sure that you do your critical analysis choice, what book or film you're going to review. Under Unit 1, you will see Week 2 is now available. You're going to be doing a module on life in the West. There's another little video quiz that Evan will be very happy about. And there's also going to be some other stuff in there that you'll have to, at the end, take a little quiz on life in the West. There is a second module on lynching in America that's going to have you create a writing piece like you did for the entrepreneurs, bankers, etc. This is a very tough module. I'm forewarning you from the standpoint of the emotional content of it. It is not a pleasant topic, but I think it is one that is incredibly important. And then the last one you're going to be looking at and creating a discussion board piece is How the Other Half Lives, which is going to explore the photographs of Jacob Riis, who was a muckraking photographer during the Progressive Era who exposed a lot of the troubles of the Gilded Age. And I think you'll find that one particularly fascinating. So that is your task for next week, to complete these 3 modules. Also, if you have not yet chosen your book or film, please do that. And please do the course intro survey. That is all I have for you guys tonight. Certainly